The courtroom buzzed with disbelief as Jamal, a teenager with quiet confidence, stepped forward. "Your Honor," he said, voice steady, "the facts speak for themselves." By the end of the trial, no one would dare underestimate him again. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension, every creak of a chair and shuffle of papers amplified in the silence. All eyes were fixed on the young teenager standing at the plaintiff's table. Jamal Brooks, dressed in an oversized navy suit and tie, held his ground despite the stares. At just 17 years old, he was an unlikely figure in this grand, wood-paneled courtroom. His hands rested lightly on a worn leather folder, containing what he believed was his strongest weapon, proof of the truth. At the judge's bench, Judge Patterson, infamous for his sharp wit and dismissive attitude, leaned back in his chair. His gavel rested loosely in one hand, and his skeptical gaze bore down on Jamal. "Let me get this straight," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're representing the plaintiff? Yourself?" A low ripple of laughter spread through the room, with a few of the attorneys exchanging amused glances. Jamal stood taller, his expression calm. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied evenly, his voice steady despite the mocking tone from the bench. Judge Patterson chuckled, shaking his head. "What is this, a high school debate club? Young man, this is a court of law, not a stage for your theatrics." The laughter grew louder, but Jamal didn't flinch. He focused on his breathing, silently counting to 3 as his mother, Angela, had taught him during stressful moments. Behind him, he could feel the anxious presence of his best friend, Malik Carter, and Malik's mother, Mrs. Carter, who clutched her purse tightly as though it were a lifeline. Malik leaned forward and whispered, "Jamal, maybe we should—" But Jamal raised a hand slightly to signal calm. He didn't need Malik's doubts right now. Instead, he turned back to Judge Patterson and spoke with a quiet confidence that was startling for someone so young. "Your Honor, I understand your skepticism, but I assure you I've come prepared. The evidence I'll present will speak for itself." The room fell silent, the boldness of Jamal's words surprising even the judge. For a moment, Patterson studied the teenager, his smirk faltering ever so slightly. But his condescension quickly returned. "We'll see about that," the judge said, leaning forward. "Proceed, but I warn you, this isn't the place for amateurs." Jamal nodded, stepping forward and opening his folder with deliberate care. From the corner of the room, the landlord, Mr. Reynolds, sat smugly with his lawyer, Mr. Cole, both exchanging knowing smirks. As Jamal began outlining his argument, the courtroom seemed to shift. He cited lease agreements, referenced tenant rights laws, and pointed out glaring contradictions in the landlord's claims. His voice was steady, his facts precise. The murmurs in the gallery faded as the audience leaned in, drawn to the unexpected depth of his knowledge. But just as the tide began to turn, Judge Patterson raised a hand, cutting Jamal off mid-sentence. "Hold on," the judge said, his tone sharp. "Where exactly did you get your legal knowledge, young man? Or are you just playing lawyer for the day?" The laughter returned, but this time it was uneasy. Jamal didn't smile. He simply met the judge's gaze with a calm intensity that hinted at something more. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Jamal replied, his voice unwavering, "if you give me a chance, I'll show you exactly what I'm capable of." The room stilled. For the first time, Judge Patterson seemed taken aback, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. The stage was set, but no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. The streets of Southside Chicago were buzzing with life, from the rhythmic sounds of basketballs bouncing on cracked pavement to the faint melody of a neighbor's old radio. Among this chaos, 17-year-old Jamal Brooks sat on the steps of his grandmother's modest home, a thick law book perched on his knees. His dark, thoughtful eyes scanned the pages with a focus that defied his age. "Jamal, you're always in those books, man," Malik Carter called from the sidewalk, spinning a basketball on his finger. His grin was infectious, his energy always high. Malik was Jamal's best friend, the kind of person who brought light to any dark corner. Jamal looked up and smirked. "Someone's got to have the brains in this friendship," he teased, closing the book. Malik laughed and leaned against the railing. "Yeah, well, while you're busy reading, I'll be dunking on folks in the league someday." He mimicked a slam dunk, his lanky frame exaggerated in the motion. Before Jamal could respond, a voice called from inside the house. "Jamal! Malik, get in here!" It was Mrs. Carter, Malik's mother. Her tone was sharp, urgent, not like her usual warm demeanor. The boys exchanged glances, unease flickering. Between them, "What's going on?" Malik muttered as they hurried inside. In the small living room, Mrs. Carter stood by the window, holding an eviction notice in her trembling hands. Her usually bright brown eyes were clouded with fear. They're trying to evict us, she said, her voice breaking. Evict you? Jamal echoed, his brows knitting together. Why? You've been in that place for years. Mrs. Carter nodded. I don't know, Jamal. I've always paid on time, but now the landlord's saying I violated the lease. Claims I've got people living there who aren't supposed to be. Malik's face darkened. That's a lie. It's just me and Ma. Who else would be there? Mrs. Carter sighed, sinking into the worn-out armchair. He doesn't care. He just wants us out so he can charge someone else more rent. But what can I do? I can't afford a lawyer, and the court date's already set. Jamal's jaw tightened, his mind racing. He knew the Carters well. They were like family to him. Mrs. Carter worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, and Malik had been his closest friend since they were kids. This wasn't just a legal issue. It was personal. Let me see that notice, Jamal said, holding out his hand. Mrs. Carter hesitated but handed it over. Jamal scanned the document, his sharp eyes picking up inconsistencies almost immediately. This doesn't make sense, he said, pointing to a clause in the lease. They can't evict you for this without proof. It's a scare tactic. Mrs. Carter shook her head. Even if it is, what can we do? I'm not a lawyer, Jamal. No, Jamal said, his voice firm. But I've been studying law for years. I can help. Malik frowned, leaning forward. Bro, are you serious? You're not even out of high school yet. Jamal shot him a determined look. And I've read more case law than half the lawyers in the city. Trust me. Mrs. Carter hesitated, glancing between Jamal and Malik. I don't know, Jamal. This is a real courtroom, not a debate team. Jamal smiled faintly. I know, Mrs. Carter. But you don't have another option right now. Let me try. Over the next week, Jamal threw himself into preparation. He spent late nights researching tenant laws, poring over case studies, and drafting arguments. His grandmother, Angela, watched him with a mixture of pride and worry. You've got the brains for this, Jamal, she said one evening, placing a plate of food beside him. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. Jamal barely looked up. I will, Grandma. I just can't let them lose their home. They're all Malik has. Meanwhile, word spread through the neighborhood. A teenager was taking on a landlord in court. Some were impressed, others skeptical. At the corner store, an older man shook his head. That boy's got guts, but he's out of his depth. Courts don't care about people like us. Jamal heard the whispers but didn't let them shake his resolve. He knew the odds were stacked against him, but he also knew this was his chance to prove something. To himself, to his community, and to anyone who doubted his ability. By the time the court date arrived, Jamal was ready. He walked into the courthouse with his grandmother, Malik, and Mrs. Carter by his side. His oversized suit didn't fit quite right, and his shoes were scuffed, but his posture was confident. Inside, the landlord, Mr. Reynolds, sat with his attorney, Mr. Cole, both exuding arrogance. Jamal could feel their eyes on him, dismissive and mocking. But he didn't care. This was his moment to fight back against injustice, and he wasn't about to back down. As they took their seats, Malik whispered, You got this, man. Show him what you're made of. Jamal nodded, clutching his folder tightly. He didn't just want to win this case. He needed to, not just for the Carters, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The first step was the hardest. Jamal sat at his grandmother's small dining table, carefully drafting the complaint for court. The faint hum of the neighborhood filtered in through the open window, but his focus was unshakable. Every word had to count. This wasn't just about Malik's family. It was about proving that justice didn't belong only to those with money and power. As Jamal finished the final paragraph, his cousin Trey leaned over his shoulder. You really think they're going to take this seriously? I mean, no offense, but you're still a kid. Trey, known for his sarcastic streak, wasn't trying to be mean. He was just voicing the doubt Jamal had already heard from others. Jamal didn't look up. The law doesn't care about age, Trey. It cares about facts. And we've got them. Trey raised an eyebrow. All right, Perry Mason, let's see how this plays out. The next morning, Jamal walked into the courthouse, a manila folder clutched in his hand. Malik and Mrs. Carter followed closely behind, their faces a mixture of hope and anxiety. Jamal's oversized blazer hung awkwardly on his slim frame, but his posture was confident. The clerk at the desk barely glanced at him as he handed over the paperwork. You sure about this, kid? The clerk asked, her tone skeptical. Absolutely, Jamal replied, his voice steady. When the complaint was officially filed, Malik's mom turned to Jamal. I don't know how to thank you, she said softly. Don't thank me yet, Jamal replied with a faint smile. The hard part's just starting. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Did you hear? Jamal Brooks filed a case in court. Some people were impressed, calling him a genius. Others shook their heads, muttering, what's he trying to prove? This isn't a school debate. Even Malik's mom, despite her gratitude, couldn't help but voice her doubts during dinner that evening. Jamal, I trust you, but are you sure about this? These landlords have money, lawyers, connections? Jamal looked up from his plate. I know it's a long shot, Mrs. Carter, but if we don't fight back, they'll keep doing this to people. We have a chance. That's all we need. When the pre-trial hearing arrived, the courthouse was abuzz. Spectators, drawn by the novelty of a teenager taking on a landlord, filled the seats. Jamal sat at the plaintiff's table, flipping through his meticulously organized notes. Across the room sat Mr. Cole, the landlord's attorney, an older man with a smug expression. Next to him, Mr. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his body language radiating arrogance. Judge Patterson entered the courtroom, his black robes billowing. His reputation preceded him, a man known for his sharp tongue and impatience. He took one look at Jamal and raised an eyebrow. You've got to be kidding me, Patterson muttered, loud enough for the room to hear. He adjusted his glasses and addressed Jamal. Are you representing the plaintiff? Yes, Your Honor, Jamal replied, standing. The judge chuckled, shaking his head. And who allowed this? This isn't a talent show, young man. This is a court of law. Snickers rippled through the courtroom. Mr. Cole smirked, leaning over to whisper something to Mr. Reynolds, who laughed. Jamal didn't flinch. With all due respect, Your Honor, I am prepared to proceed. Patterson sighed, clearly unimpressed. We'll see about that. As the pretrial hearing progressed, Jamal laid out the key points of his argument. He presented proof of Mrs. Carter's rent payments, including receipts and correspondence with the landlord. He also referenced local housing laws that explicitly protected tenants from baseless evictions. Despite Jamal's composure, Judge Patterson interrupted him frequently. Do you even know what precedent means? The judge sneered at one point. I do, Your Honor, Jamal replied calmly. And if I may continue, I'll demonstrate how precedent supports this case. Mr. Cole, meanwhile, leaned into the mockery. This will be over quickly, he said during a recess, loud enough for Jamal to hear. The kid's just playing lawyer. Let him have his fun. But Jamal wasn't deterred. He spent the night before the next hearing reviewing every detail of the case, his grandmother occasionally stopping by to offer tea and quiet encouragement. You've got the heart for this, Jamal, she said softly. Don't let them shake you. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Would the kid lawyer prove himself, or would this be a lesson in humility? Jamal knew the answer depended on one thing: his ability to stay focused under pressure. As the court date loomed, he took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was doing this, not for recognition, but to give Malik's family a fighting chance. The courtroom was a sea of quiet whispers as Jamal stood at the plaintiff's table, his notes meticulously arranged in front of him. The weight of the moment was heavy, but he showed no sign of nervousness. His calm confidence was a sharp contrast to Judge Patterson, who leaned back in his chair, his expression teeming with skepticism. So, Mr. Daniels, Judge Patterson drawled, glancing down at Jamal, are you here to teach us all about the law? Do you even know what precedent means? His words dripped with condescension, earning a few chuckles from the defense's side. Jamal, unfazed, met the judge's gaze. Your Honor, he began steadily, precedent is what allows us to hold people accountable to the law consistently. And today I intend to show this court exactly how the law protects my clients. The judge raised an eyebrow, slightly taken aback by the teenager's calm retort. He waved a hand dismissively. Proceed then. Let's see if you can impress us. Jamal turned to face the courtroom, his voice clear and deliberate. He started with the lease agreement, pointing out its specific terms. This document clearly states that the landlord is responsible for providing a safe and habitable space. My clients, Malik's family, have paid rent on time every month. He held up receipts as evidence. And yet they were accused of lease violations that have no basis in fact. Across the room, Mr. Cole, the landlord's attorney, smirked. He leaned over to whisper something to Mr. Reynolds, who sat stiffly in his seat. Reynolds's smug expression made Jamal's jaw tighten, but he pressed on. Jamal then presented photos of the family's apartment, peeling paint, broken heating, and a leaking ceiling. These living conditions, he said, his voice rising with conviction, are violations of tenant rights. Yet instead of addressing these issues, the landlord fabricated false claims to evict them. Why? So he could charge higher rent to new tenants. Mr. Cole stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. This is conjecture, not evidence. Judge Patterson sighed. Sustained. Mr. Daniels, stick to the facts. Jamal nodded, not missing a beat. Let's stick to the facts then. He walked to the evidence table, picking up a stack of documents. Here are the receipts proving rent was paid on time. And here, he added, holding up another sheet, are witness statements from neighbors confirming that the alleged lease violations never occurred. The courtroom grew quieter as murmurs of doubt rippled through the defense. Judge Patterson adjusted his glasses, skimming the documents Jamal had provided. Mr. Cole, clearly irritated, rose to call his witness. Your Honor, I'd like to bring Mr. Reynolds to the stand. The landlord shuffled forward, his bulky frame squeezed into a suit that looked too tight. He sat down with an air of arrogance, his gaze flickering briefly to Jamal before focusing on Mr. Cole. Mr. Reynolds, Cole began, can you confirm that the Daniels family violated their lease by subletting to multiple tenants? Reynolds nodded emphatically. Absolutely. I've seen them with my own eyes, people coming and going all the time. It's clear they weren't following the rules. Jamal watched closely, his sharp eyes catching the slight twitch of Reynolds' lips. When it was his turn to cross-examine, Jamal stood and walked toward the witness stand. His calm footsteps echoed in the room. Mr. Reynolds, Jamal began, you claim you saw multiple people entering and leaving the apartment. Can you provide specific dates and times? Reynolds blinked, shifting in his seat. Well, not exact dates, but it was a regular thing. Jamal tilted his head. Regular? So in your records, there should be reports of these incidents, correct? Reynolds hesitated. I didn't think I needed to write it down. It was obvious. Jamal's voice sharpened. You're asking this court to accept your word without evidence. Isn't it true, Mr. Reynolds, that your claims were fabricated to justify an eviction? That's ridiculous, Reynolds barked, his face red. I don't need to fabricate anything. Jamal stepped closer. Then why did you ignore repair requests for months? Why were eviction notices sent immediately after my clients requested repairs? Reynolds opened his mouth to respond but faltered. The courtroom hung on the silence, the weight of the question lingering like a held breath. The gallery began to stir. Spectators exchanged glances, their earlier doubt giving way to admiration. Even Judge Patterson leaned forward, his condescension giving way to curiosity. Jamal continued, his voice steady and deliberate. Your Honor, I have provided clear evidence of my client's innocence and the landlord's negligence. This is not just a fight for one family, but a fight for fairness and dignity. The judge's gaze lingered on Jamal for a moment longer than usual. We'll see, Mr. Daniels, he said, his tone less biting. As Jamal returned to his seat, Malik's mother gave him a grateful nod, her eyes brimming with hope. Jamal didn't need applause or recognition. He knew the real battle was far from over. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Judge Patterson leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he watched Jamal meticulously lay out his arguments. But his tone was as cutting as ever. Mr. Daniels, the judge interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Do you even understand the weight of this case? Enough with this charade. You're not qualified to argue something this serious. Who even are you? The courtroom went silent. All eyes turned to Jamal, who stood calm and composed, though a flicker of determination sparked in his eyes. He could feel Malik's mother's anxious gaze on him and hear the faint murmurs of spectators questioning whether the judge was right. But Jamal didn't flinch. He slowly reached into his folder, pulled out a single piece of paper, and walked toward the bench. Your Honor, he said, his voice steady and unwavering. Since you've asked, I'll provide clarity. I passed the bar exam at 16. I am a certified attorney. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A reporter sitting in the back dropped her pen, scrambling to scribble notes. Malik's mom clutched her chest, her face a mixture of disbelief and pride. Even Mr. Cole, the landlord's smug attorney, visibly stiffened, his smirk vanishing as his jaw tightened. Judge Patterson froze mid-motion, the condescension in his expression faltering. You're saying you're an attorney? Yes, Your Honor. Jamal held up the document, a certificate of his credentials, signed and sealed. And here, he added, retrieving another paper, is a letter from the Bar Association confirming my qualifications. I've practiced law under mentorship and complied with every legal requirement. The judge took the papers from the bailiff with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the documents, and his face reddened as realization set in. He had been openly mocking a certified attorney in front of a packed courtroom. This can't be real, Judge Patterson stammered, though his voice lacked the conviction it carried earlier. He looked at Jamal with a mixture of confusion and, for the first time, respect. Jamal stood tall, his gaze unwavering. Every word I've spoken in this courtroom is legally sound, Your Honor. Shall we continue? The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the soft rustling of papers. The spectators, once filled with doubt, now sat in awe. In the back of the courtroom, Malik leaned over to his mom. I told you Jamal was different, he whispered, his voice full of pride. Judge Patterson cleared his throat, fumbling to regain control of the courtroom. Very well, he said, his voice more measured. You may proceed, Mr. Daniels, but I advise you to tread carefully. This is still a serious matter. Jamal gave a slight nod, returning to his seat with the calm demeanor he had carried all along. He felt the shift in the room. No longer was he just a teenager trying to argue a case. He was now recognized as the brilliant attorney he had worked so hard to become. Mr. Cole wasn't ready to concede, though. Rising from his chair, he tried to regain the upper hand. Your Honor, even if he has credentials, his age makes him unfit to represent this case properly. This is unprecedented. The judge shot him a sharp look. Mr. Cole, unless you're here to present evidence, I suggest you take your seat. The courtroom buzzed with quiet chatter as reporters scribbled furiously. Some spectators had already pulled out their phones, quietly texting about the Prodigy lawyer who had just stunned everyone. Jamal returned to his arguments, now fully commanding the room. He dissected the landlord's claims with precision, pointing out every inconsistency and backing his points with legal precedents. Each sentence was deliberate, his voice ringing with authority. But even as Jamal continued, he could see the ripple effect of his reveal. People sat a little straighter. They listened more closely. For the first time, he wasn't just defending Malik's family. He was showing everyone in the room that determination and skill had no age or boundary. When the session adjourned for the day, Malik's mom approached Jamal, her eyes shimmering with emotion. You didn't just fight for us today, she said softly. You showed the world what you're capable of. Jamal smiled faintly, glancing back at the now empty courtroom. We're not done yet, he replied, his voice quiet but resolute. Because while the judge had been stunned and the audience awed, Jamal knew the toughest battles were still ahead. The courtroom atmosphere had shifted, but the battle was far from over. Jamal's reveal as a certified attorney had stunned everyone, leaving the judge and the audience scrambling to reconcile the prodigy standing before them. But Mr. Cole, the landlord's seasoned attorney, wasn't about to back down. Behind his forced calm, his frustration simmered. During the recess, Mr. Cole stormed into a private conference room where the landlord, Mr. Reynolds, waited. We can't let this kid win, Cole hissed, his voice low but sharp. Reynolds crossed his arms, scowling. What do you suggest? He's tearing us apart in there. We need to fight dirty, Cole said, a sinister glint in his eye. I'll handle it. Let's give the court something that will make them doubt him and his client. The plan was set. When court resumed, the defense came armed with a new strategy. Cole stood confidently, holding a folder that looked almost too pristine. He cleared his throat dramatically. Your Honor, the defense has uncovered new evidence that we believe is crucial to this case, he announced. Jamal's brows furrowed as he exchanged a glance with Malik's mother, who looked visibly uneasy. New evidence? She whispered. Jamal's calm mask didn't slip. He simply nodded, his mind already strategizing. Mr. Cole continued, holding up a series of photographs and sworn affidavits. These documents and images show proof that the plaintiff's family has been subletting their apartment illegally in direct violation of the lease agreement. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, his expression skeptical. This is a serious claim, Mr. Cole. Do you have proof to support it? Indeed, Your Honor, Cole said smoothly, handing the documents to the bailiff. The photographs clearly depict other individuals entering and leaving the apartment frequently, and the affidavits corroborate these activities. Jamal's jaw tightened. He could feel the weight of the gallery's stares and the rising doubt in the room. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, a smug grin creeping across his face. The judge flipped through the documents, his brow furrowing. This evidence raises valid concerns, Patterson said. He turned to Jamal. Mr. Daniels, you will have the opportunity to respond to these allegations tomorrow. Court is adjourned for the day. As the gavel struck, Malik's mom slumped in her chair, her face pale. What do we do now? She asked Jamal as they exited the courtroom. Jamal placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We fight, he said simply. They're trying to intimidate us, but we won't let them. I promise. That evening, Jamal retreated to his makeshift office in his small bedroom. Papers were scattered across the desk, and his laptop glowed faintly in the dim light. He called his cousin Trey, a tech-savvy college student with a knack for uncovering digital secrets. Trey, I need your help, Jamal said, his voice firm. The defense presented photos and affidavits claiming subletting violations. Something feels off about it. I'm on it, Trey replied, already pulling up his tools. Send me everything you've got. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the soft clicks of Jamal's keyboard and Trey's updates over the phone. Got it, Trey suddenly exclaimed, his voice triumphant. These photos were doctored, and poorly at that. The metadata shows they were created just last week, not months ago like they're claiming. And the affidavits? Jamal asked, leaning forward. One of the witnesses is linked to Reynolds. She works for a property management firm tied to him, Trey revealed. The others? No legit connections to the case. It's all fabricated. Jamal exhaled, relief washing over him. You're a lifesaver, Trey. Send me everything. The next morning, Jamal walked into the courtroom with a quiet confidence. As proceedings began, he stood to address the court. Your Honor, while the defense's new evidence appears damning, I've uncovered proof that it is entirely fraudulent, Jamal stated firmly. He handed a packet of documents to the bailiff, detailing Trey's findings. The metadata on these photos shows they were fabricated recently, not during the alleged time frame. Furthermore, one of the witnesses works for Mr. Reynolds, creating a clear conflict of interest. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Reynolds' smug grin vanished as Cole scrambled to object. These claims are baseless, Cole barked. Jamal turned to the judge. Your Honor, I anticipated this reaction. I've included additional evidence proving the photos were altered and that the witnesses have no credibility. Judge Patterson studied the documents, his expression darkening. He looked up at Cole. Mr. Cole, this is unacceptable. Fabricating evidence to manipulate this court is a serious offense. This evidence is disallowed, and I will be issuing a formal reprimand. Cole's face flushed red. Reynolds muttered something under his breath, his earlier confidence now shattered. Jamal returned to his seat, his face calm, but his heart racing. Malik's mom leaned over, whispering, You did it. Jamal smiled faintly. We're not done yet, he replied. The victory was sweet, but he knew the battle wasn't over. The air in the courtroom was heavy with anticipation. The final day of the trial had arrived, and all eyes were on Jamal. The young attorney sat at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded neatly over his notes. Despite the mounting pressure, his face radiated a calm confidence that steadied Malik's mother beside him. Do you think we'll win? She whispered, her voice trembling. Jamal turned to her, his gaze steady. We will, he said firmly. The truth is on our side. Judge Patterson entered, his gavel striking sharply against the sound block. The courtroom fell silent. This court will now hear closing arguments, he announced, glancing toward the defense table. Mr. Cole, you may proceed. Mr. Cole rose, his steps deliberate as he approached the front of the room. His tailored suit and confident smirk suggested he still believed he could salvage the case. "Your Honor," he began, his tone slick, "this case has been blown completely out of proportion. My client, Mr. Reynolds, is a respected landlord who has simply been misunderstood. The accusations made against him lack real substance. This is nothing more than a smear campaign orchestrated by the plaintiff and a child pretending to be a lawyer." The gallery stirred at his pointed jab. Cole's words were sharp, but they didn't faze Jamal. He kept his focus, jotting down notes as the defense lawyer rambled on. Cole ended his argument with an air of triumph, gesturing toward the judge. "I trust this court will see through the theatrics and dismiss these baseless claims." Judge Patterson nodded and turned to Jamal. "Mr. Daniels, you may proceed." Jamal rose slowly, each movement deliberate. He adjusted his blazer, walked to the front of the room, and turned to face the judge, the defense, and the gallery. His voice when he spoke was calm, yet carried an undeniable weight. "Your Honor, this case is not about theatrics or misunderstandings," Jamal began. "It's about justice. It's about a family being wrongfully evicted, a landlord exploiting his position, and a system that often fails those who need it most." The courtroom was silent as he continued, his words weaving a narrative that was both precise and deeply moving. Mr. Reynolds fabricated evidence. He manipulated the system to displace a hard-working family, a family that paid their rent on time and followed every rule. Why? So he could profit at their expense. And when confronted with the truth, he resorted to lies and intimidation to silence them. Jamal paused, scanning the room. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, while Reynolds stared at the table, avoiding eye contact. "But this isn't just about Malik's family," Jamal continued, his voice softening but losing none of its power. "This is about every family who's been told they don't matter. Every tenant who's been threatened, manipulated, or treated as disposable. This case represents a chance to set a precedent, to say that landlords like Mr. Reynolds cannot and will not get away with this." He stepped closer to the judge, holding up the lease agreement. "The evidence is clear. Malik's family did nothing wrong. They deserve to stay in their home, and they deserve justice for the pain and fear they've endured." Jamal turned back to the gallery, his gaze sweeping over the spectators. "Today, we have the opportunity to show that justice doesn't belong to the powerful. It belongs to everyone." As he returned to his seat, a ripple of emotion swept through the courtroom. Malik's mom squeezed Jamal's hand, her eyes brimming with gratitude. Judge Patterson sat in silence for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he cleared his throat. "This court will take a brief recess before delivering its verdict." The room buzzed with low whispers as the judge exited. Malik's mom turned to Jamal. "That was incredible," she said, her voice breaking. Jamal gave a small smile. "We're not done yet," he replied. When the judge returned, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone held their breath as he delivered his decision. "After reviewing the evidence and testimony presented," Patterson began, his tone solemn, "this court rules in favor of the plaintiff, Malik's family. The eviction is nullified, and the defendant, Mr. Reynolds, is ordered to pay damages for wrongful eviction and emotional distress." The courtroom erupted. Applause echoed off the walls as Malik's mother covered her face, tears streaming down her cheeks. Jamal exhaled deeply, a quiet smile spreading across his face. Judge Patterson raised a hand to silence the room. "Mr. Daniels," he said, addressing Jamal directly, "you've demonstrated extraordinary skill and professionalism. I underestimated you, and for that I apologize. You have a bright future ahead." Jamal nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor." As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, Jamal turned to Malik's mom. "We did it," he said simply. "No," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "You did it." Jamal glanced around the courtroom, taking in the smiling faces, the murmurs of admiration, and the sense of justice that hung in the air. He knew this victory wasn't just about one family. It was a step toward something much bigger. The courthouse buzzed with energy as Jamal stepped outside, the weight of the trial finally lifting. Malik's mom rushed to him, tears in her eyes. "You gave us our home back," she whispered, gripping his hands. "I'll never forget this." Jamal smiled humbly. You believed in me, Miss Johnson. That's all I needed. The next morning, Jamal's name was everywhere. Headlines like Teen Prodigy Wins Landmark Case went viral. Emails poured in, families asking for help, sharing their stories of unjust evictions. One read, "Thank you for giving us hope. If you can fight, so can we." Sitting at his kitchen table, Jamal spoke to his mom and cousin Trey. "I want to do more," he said, determination in his voice. Trey grinned. "Sounds like you're building a movement, bro." Together, they launched the Justice Collective, a program offering free legal aid to vulnerable families. With Trey handling tech and volunteers joining the cause, it quickly gained momentum. Meanwhile, news broke of the landlord's downfall. Investigations revealed years of fraud, and his properties were seized. Jamal knew this was just the beginning. As Malik's mom had reminded him, one victory could spark change, and he was ready to fight for it.